All right, three, two, one. Hi, this is William Ramsey. Welcome to William Ramsey Investigates. On tonight's show, I have a very special guest. Her name is Christine Pelisek, and she published a book in 2017 on a subject, a serial killer that took place, or serial killings that took place close to where I live in Los Angeles. This specifically took place in South Central LA. The title of the book is The Grim Sleeper, The Lost Women of South Central, published June 5th, 2017. So we're going to cover some of the information. She worked at the LA Weekly and had the first-hand account and involvement with the case. So, Christine, are you there?
Yes, hi.
Hi, thanks for agreeing to the interview. For people who don't know your name, Christine Pelisek, Pelisek, can you talk a little bit about your background and how you became involved in the Grim Sleeper serial killing case?
Sure. I was working at the LA Weekly at the time when I found out about the case. It was back in 2006, and I was a crime reporter there. I had been there for a few years and basically covered murders and robberies, etc. for the Weekly. And I also regularly would go over to the coroner's office just to see if he had any cases for me to write about. And on one particular day, I was over there in 2016, early 2016, and he told me about a serial killer task force that the coroner was setting up to look into a series of deaths in LA County. And the investigators at the coroner's office had noticed a large number of women who were killed between the years 2002 and 2006, and they wondered if it was the work of a serial killer. And so they wanted to put together a task force to see if any of the cases were linked. And all the cases were women in LA County. Some of them were found in dumpsters. Some of them were found in alleys. Some of them were found in their home. It was really a real mix. And there was 38 women on the list. And so they wanted to kind of look to see if any of these cases might be linked. And so when the investigator told me about this, when I went over there, he had said that the coroner's office was going to do it, and I tried to get specific information about, out of him, and he didn't want to talk to me about it, and he kind of told me to not say anything until they kind of figured out what was going on. Part of the reason the coroner decided to look into it was because they weren't really getting a lot of information from the police departments about each individual case, so they decided they were going to kind of look into it on their own. So after a couple of months of me pestering the coroner investigator, he finally told me that he would let me have this list of these women. And so he gave it to me. This was probably about 3 months after he initially told me about it. And so I ended up looking at the list, and there was just a mixed group of women. I guess there was 18 of them were African-American women. The other was, Hispanic women, Caucasian women, Asian women, and all of them were different. Like, the deaths were all different. So what I did was I ended up contacting all the different law enforcement agencies to see if any of the cases were linked. And that took a while because it was hard to get a hold of the detectives. And a lot of it, which I noticed that a lot of them, depending, because there were law enforcement agencies all over Southern California. So I was calling like Long Beach Police Department, LA County Sheriff, LAPD, most of them, looking in to see what happened to these women. And so I finally I went through the list, and some of the women had been killed by their boyfriends, and the boyfriend had since been arrested. Other ones, it turned out they died from natural causes. Other ones they died from overdoses. There was one case where a woman was with a man in a car, and she died of an overdose, and he didn't want anyone to know, like, he was involved, so he ended up setting the car on fire. And the woman, his fingerprints and the woman was burned. And so then, basically I went through the list, and I ended up getting to number 37 on the list. It was a young runaway from Inglewood named Princess Berthamew. And I ended up finally getting a hold of the detective handling that case, and he told me that her case was linked to my number 38 case on the list, a woman named Valerie McCorvey, who was an LAPD case, that her case, the two of those cases were linked to a series of murders that happened back in the 80s in South Los Angeles. And in those cases, all the women were shot with a 25 caliber pistol in the chest, and they were all linked through DNA. And so he ended up telling me this, and then I ended up writing a story for the LA Weekly about it. And so that's kind of how it all got started.
And that title of the story, that's was that when you coined this kind of sobriquet for who was doing the killers? Is that correct, or was that a later?
No, it came later. So I ended up doing a story about it. First of all, that there was a serial killer out there, and then what happened was the LAPD started a secret task force to look into it in 2017 when the killer struck again. The killer struck again on January 1st, 2017. A girl by the name of Laverne Peters was found in a dumpster in South Los Angeles. She was actually her killer had put her in a garbage bag, and they, the investigators were pretty amazing because they ended up checking the twist tie on the garbage bag, and they found saliva from the twist tie that linked to all the cases, like the 2002 case of Princess Bertha, the Valerie McCorvey case in 2003, and then the series of the murders back in the 80s. And that's when my editor and I coined the phrase "the groom sleeper," and that he had returned and he struck again.
Right, and there was a 13-year kind of silence between these connections, and I think you wrote in your book that many of the families of these victims did not know that their loved one was part of a serial killing. Is that correct?
Well, right. That's exactly right. I mean, a lot of the victims' families, daughters and sisters, died in the 80s, had only spoken to the detectives like once or twice and then hadn't heard from them at all. And so when I was doing my investigation, I ended up contacting the family members, and I was door knocking, and I went in there, and some of the cases, I was literally the first one, to tell them that their, daughter was killed by a serial killer. They were pretty upset that the police didn't let the community know that there was a serial killer out there. And so it caused, a bit of a problem with the police department because, they were upset over the fact that, they weren't told. Right. And that, this guy was like a danger to the community. He was out there killing women, and nobody knew about it.
Yeah, it's really remarkable. And those kind of early murders that happened in 85 to 88, I think there were 9 in total. It happened during a kind of a tumultuous time in Los Angeles. There was like a crack epidemic. And so do you think that might have had something to do with the fact that these women's lives who lost their lives were overlooked or undervalued maybe?
Well, I think a lot of that had to do with it because it was, during the 80s and the 90s, there was over 1,000 murders in Los Angeles at the time. And I mean, compared to today, there's like 200 and something, So back then there was like so many murders. It was like sort of the start of, gang shootings, and it was this huge crack cocaine epidemic. There were so many murders, and I think that a lot of these women got lost in that. And, I was talking to some detectives, back, who worked South Los Angeles back then, and they said that there'd be like 6 detectives, working a particular police division, and they'd have to handle like 3 or 4 murders over the weekend. And if you can think about that, they go to one murder scene and then immediately, they're called to another murder scene. And, so it makes it really, really difficult to try to be able to solve these cases, when you have a situation like that. And so, I think these women became like collateral damage to that, because they would just jump around, and I don't think they were able to. I mean, I think they tried as best as they could, but, given the circumstances, they had their hands full. And I think that the LAPD brass, at the time, they were more focused on other, high-profile cases. Like back then, right when one of the first murders happened was right around the time of the Night Stalker with Richard Ramirez. Right. And there was a lot of press conferences and things like that about, him, running around the community, but there wasn't much going on with regard to press conferences about, the women that were, disappearing and ending up, dead in alleys.
Right. And those earlier cases, I think you called him, he had a name like the South Side Slayer, wasn't? But there, I think Tom Bradley, and there was also like a community activist, Margaret Prescott, who was kind of on the ground, kind of talking about these problems. Can you talk a little bit about Margaret Prescott?
Yeah, sure. Well, originally, I'll just go back to the Southside Slayer for a second.
Please do.
Back then, they actually thought there was like one detective. There was like robbery homicide, was sort of the elite LAPD unit, and they were looking into some of the cases. And so they originally they thought it was like one killer, and so they dubbed him the Southside Slayer. But as time went on, they realized that it wasn't just one person responsible for the murders, because it turned out that there were 6 serial killers working at the same time back in the 80s. And the Grim Sleeper was just one of the many serial killers that were murdering women back then. And so that's how they originally, they called him the Southside Slayer. But then, as the time went by, they realized, it wasn't just one guy. And they ended up arresting 2 guys back in the 80s. And then the other ones were not caught until later on when the LAPD started this cold case unit back in 2001. And they were able to unearth, because of new DNA technology, some of the guys that were, killing women back in the 80s. But back then, with Margaret Prescott, she actually was an activist back then, and she was really important for, putting the word out and everything, because she'd stage press conferences and rallies at LAPD headquarters, trying to get the police to do something about it, because, she was getting calls from families saying, my, sister's missing or my mother's missing, and, people were calling her about bodies, being found, and, so she wanted the police to be accountable to let them know in the community just how many women were being murdered, because she didn't believe the numbers. Like they would say, so-and-so got killed, but then she'd hear that more people did, so she was really trying to hold the police accountable for their actions. Right.
And there was like was it the early case where there was one survivor that was able to kind of tell the story of how she escaped him? Isn't that right?
Yeah, well, actually, it turned out that there's at least 2 survivors now. One of them was one of the first victims back in 1984, but they didn't find out about her until he ended up going to trial years later. But the woman you're talking about, she was attacked, Anitria, she was attacked in 1988, and she was able to provide a description to the police, so they had sort of an idea that they were looking for an African-American male around the age of 30, and one of the big things that she was able to tell the police was that her attacker was driving a orange Pinto, and so that ended up becoming like an important detail. Unfortunately, they weren't able to find an orange Pinto, but, they were able to, sort of search around to try to find it. But she also, one of the things she did also, too, was she was able to take the police to the neighborhood where she was attacked. And it turned out, she was really pretty much accurate. She pointed out this house that turned out to be 3 doors down from where Lonnie Franklin, the Grim Sleeper, lived.
Wow, yeah. And you kind of became acquainted with her, correct? She kind of had some survivor's guilt. She was one of the few who kind of made it.
Yeah, I talked to, after I found out about it, I ended up finding out that there was a survivor, so I reached out to her, and originally she didn't want to talk to me at all, but then she finally agreed, and actually her and I drove around the neighborhood kind of looking for the house, because, we had no idea, and, it was 20-something years later, so she had a hard time remembering exactly where it was that he dropped her off. And so we ended up driving around a lot. And she was, but she had said to me, there were so many, especially going through the trial and everything, she felt, there were so many family members there who lost a child, and she actually survived. So she felt, like she didn't belong in the group.
Right. And she actually was really shot, strong. Though. She was shot in the chest, correct?
That's right. Yeah. She was going to a friend's house, to a party, and she was going down the street, and she was at this neighborhood liquor store, and she was standing there, and this car pulls up, and this guy asks her if she wants to ride, and she tells him no, get lost kind of thing. And then he gets out of the car, and he's kind of chatting with her, and when she looked at him, she didn't feel scared of him at all. She kind of thought he was like nerdy looking, and she wasn't, he struck her as, just a everyday kind of guy who was just trying to pick her up, sort of thing. And so he was like, do you want to ride? And she said, no. And then he was like, well, why not? Blah, blah, blah. And then she finally like agreed. She was like, all right, it was only a few blocks. So she got in the car with him. And then he ends up saying that he has to stop at his uncle's house to get some money. So she's like, okay, whatever. So he pulls up in front of his uncle's house, or he claims to be his uncle's house, and he gets out of the car, goes in, and then comes back. And then when he gets back in the car, she said that's when like his demeanor completely changed. He started asking like, "What are you dogging me for?" and called her a different name. And she was like, "What are you talking about?" And then he actually drove like just literally like 1 or 2 blocks, and then he pulled over. And by this time it was like later in the evening, so I think that she met up with him around 6 or 7, and then it was a little later, so it was kind of, I guess it was dark at the time that he shot her. So anyway, so he pulls over, and then he started like yelling at her, and then he shot her in the chest, and she said that she kind of started blacking out, and she woke up to him sexually assaulting her, and then she woke up again to a Polaroid flash, and she realized that he had taken a Polaroid photo of her. And, she was telling him, like, take her to the hospital and everything, and he was like, no. And then at one point, he just opened the door and pushed her out. And then he drove off, and she actually got up and walked, like, a mile or so to her friend's house and knocked on her friend's door, but the friend wasn't there and, like, was literally lying on the friend's porch when the friend came home and saw her in the condition she was in, called for an ambulance, and she rushed the ambulance, and she was in shock, and she certainly almost died, but she survived to tell the police, to give them the description, and, it's quite a harrowing tale.
Yeah. And the MO was the same with her as it was with other victims, where it looked like they had been pushed out of a car, right? They had bruises and...
Yeah, well, it was very similar. Like, he shot all the victims the same way. I mean, some were shot once, some were shot multiple times, but it was all pretty much in the chest. So it looked like he was driving his vehicle or was in the driver's side when he leaned over and shot his victim in the chest, because it was all kind of going the same trajectory, sort of going down. So they seemed to think, later that this is exactly like he was sitting in the driver's seat and leaned over and shot, and then tossed them out of the car. Like, he had, like, most of them were found in, like, alleyways. Some of them were found in dumpsters. There's a couple of women that were found in dumpsters, and they were pretty surprised that he was able to, lift them up and be able to, like, toss them in these dumpsters. So there was all, and he also, put a lot of debris over his victims. Like, a lot of them were found with, like, old dirty mattresses on top of them, or blankets. One of them had like a gas tank on top of her. So he was, definitely trying to hide the bodies, but, of course somebody was going to find them at one point. There are a few of them, it took like a week or so before they found the remains. Other ones were found, quite soon after he killed them.
Fascinating. And then how was after the kind of fairly recently, late 2008-9, there was the 800 task force. Can you talk about how this new group was put together to try to find the Grim Sleeper?
Right. Well, originally there was a few detectives that knew about after the LAPD started their cold case unit, there was like one detective in particular who was looking at all the old cases to see if there was any DNA that they could send off to the Department of Justice to get tested. They had, LAPD has like 9,000, robbery homicide has like 9,000, cold cases. So they were looking through, there was a group of them from this cold case unit. So they were looking through all the old cases just to see if there would be any kind of forensic evidence that could be tested. They got a grant from the Department of Justice, and so they were going through all the files. And so this detective, he remembered the Southside Slayer killings back in the 80s. So he actually went searching for all the cases to see if there was any DNA that could be tested. And so he ended up finding, a lot of the Southside Slayer cases, and ended up putting them in to be tested. And so that was in like 2002, 2003. And then all of a sudden, the cases started coming back, and they realized that, Princess's case, linked to Valerie McCorvey's case in 2003, and those cases were linked to the cases in the 80s. And so what happened was, so they were, there was this detective, he was working on the case, and then all of a sudden the killer struck again, and they realized it was through that DNA that was found on the twist tie. And so that was January 1st, 2017, and then the LAPD, when they got the news, like literally 3 months later, when they got the news that Janisha Peters' case was linked to all the other murders, the LAPD started this task force to look into it.
Right, and that was 2007. 2007, just to...
That's right.
Sorry. So you said 2017. So it was the 800 task force was compiled after they realized...
Oh, sorry.
It's okay. It's okay. So it was compiled after they realized the early cases were related to the newer cases, correct?
Well, it was started after they found out about Janisha Peters.
Gotcha. So they started, and then I think you was like these guys, Kilcoyne, Shepard, were in contact with some of these victims' families, and were really trying to look around. Well, can you talk about what familial DNA testing is?
Right. Well, that's basically the problem that the detectives had with trying to figure out who the killer was the fact that they had his DNA. He left his saliva on basically the breasts of most of his victims, but he wasn't in any kind of felon data bank like CODIS. He wasn't in like a state data bank or, a federal data bank. So it pretty much meant that he had not spent any time in prison, because if you're convicted of a serious crime, you end up getting swabbed. Your swab then goes into this data bank, and it could be used by law enforcement, in other cases. So in this case, the killer's DNA was not in the federal or state data bank, so they had no idea who he was. They knew that the killer was linked to all these cases through DNA, but they just didn't have his name. So that was a problem. So what happened was in 2008, they decided they were going to do this familial DNA test. And the familial DNA test is that you're looking for a relative who has the same, like a similar DNA profile as you do. Like if you have a perfect match for your DNA, you have like a 14 loci, but a relative might be like a 10 or 11. So they wanted to find somebody, like they wanted to find a relative, and they were hoping that the killer had a son or a brother or a nephew or an uncle who was in the prison system, and who would be, if they checked for him, he might come up, and then they could track down the killer through that person. And they had this study done in England where they said that if you're a felon, like if you're a criminal, there's a 40% chance that you're going to have a relative who also is. So they were hoping that they would be able to find like a brother or an uncle, etc. And so what happened was in 2008, they did this test, and it came back nothing at all. And so there were, they kept having to investigate, look over the files again, interview suspects, and they spent a lot of time. Like over the course of the investigation, they took about 100 DNA samples from different witnesses and things like that, where they'd surreptitiously go and follow some guy and pick up a can or a cigarette butt. Other ones, like they asked them for their DNA, but a few of them they actually, tailed them, followed them around looking for their DNA. And so,
but they did catch during their investigation. I thought it was interesting that they caught another really intense serial rapist. The West Side rapist was just somebody they were looking for as well, but that was a fortuitous event, right?
Yeah, that was pretty amazing that they were able to find that guy, because he was responsible for about 50 rapes in the Wilshire area of Los Angeles. So yeah, that was amazing. It was a different detective, Diane Webb, who worked with all the sex offenders, and she thought that they'd probably find the killer through the sex offenders, and there was like a large number of sex offenders, and so she actually looked at all the sex offenders in the LAPD territory to see if some of them had not gotten, like if you're a sex offender, you have to get, swabbed. And so they were checking to see if all the sex offenders, had been swabbed, because sometimes, they fall through the cracks. And it turned out that there was about 100 of them or so that actually fell through the cracks. And so then they sent them notification that they had to get swabbed. And so this guy, John Floyd Thomas, who was like insurance adjuster. He was like 72 years old. He ends up going to the LAPD station and gets swabbed, and then 3 months later, his DNA comes back to, all these different crime scenes all over like LA County. So he ended up pleading guilty, and he's in prison now because of the murders. He attacked elderly white women, and he killed a number of them, and they believed he was responsible for about 50 rapes.
It's incredible. So eventually, there was the son of of Lonnie, who was the one who eventually got put into the system. Can you talk about that?
Yeah. So in 2010, they decided to try it again. They found out that there was 400,000 more felons added to CODIS, like the data bank, and so they thought, well, maybe, who knows, maybe a relative of the killer would be one of those 400,000 that was put into the data bank in those 2 years. And so it turned out they were right. It hit on a 28-year-old named Christopher Franklin, and they knew Christopher was obviously too young to have been involved in the 80s murders. He would have been like 1 or 2 at the time, but they knew he was related to the killer. And so they looked, they looked to find his relatives, and they looked in San Bernardino, Rancho Cucamonga, all these areas, but they found that his father, Lonnie Franklin Jr., lived in like the epicenter of where all the murders took place. He lived on 81st and Western, and 81st and Western was like literally all the murders like just happened around the area. Like, and it turned out that one of the victims, Lucretia Jefferson, lived in an apartment complex on the corner of 81st and Western. Princess Berthomew was found about 2 blocks away. Barbara Ware was found about 4 blocks away. And also, Anitria Washington, the survivor, she picked the house that literally was 3 doors down from where Lonnie Franklin lived.
Wow.
So what happened was, so they thought, oh my God, this must be the guy. And so they ended up surveilling him. And for the first couple of days, they had no luck. And he went out. When they caught him, when they thought he was a suspect, he's married. He was a grandfather of 2. He was a mechanic. He had worked in South Los Angeles in the 80s as a garbage man, so he had intricate knowledge of the alleyways in the area. He had retired from that and was a mechanic, and actually was a car thief and was involved in stolen goods like in the area, but and he had gotten like a series of arrests over the years, but it wasn't enough for him to actually go to prison and to get swabbed. And so anyway, so they end up following him around, and on the first night he's with his girlfriend, and they follow him around, but he doesn't drop anything. And then the second night they actually find him like he leaves his house around 2 o'clock in the morning. He's trolling for a prostitute, and he's seen they have like a car following him, and they see him talking to a girl, and then this other police car kind of comes up behind him, and he drives off. And then finally, a couple of days later, he's with his girlfriend and her 2 kids, and he goes to a pizza place, and one of the undercover detectives dresses up as a busboy and goes into the restaurant. He's there for a party. Lonnie Franklin is there for a party, and he's in the back room, and he's sitting there with a group of people, and this busboy / undercover agent goes back there and starts collecting all the plates and everything, and has like a special bin for Lonnie Franklin's plates, and starts collecting Lonnie Franklin's plates. And when they get everything, they got like a pizza slice, they got like a fork, a napkin, etc. And they immediately take it to the lab, and within 24 hours it came back as a match. They matched it from the pizza slice, the hardened cheese. They were able to get a saliva sample from it.
Remarkable. So then he was arrested, and he denied any involvement, correct?
That's right. He was interrogated by detectives, and he denied knowing the women, all of the women.
And so he denied it. And the trial for Lonnie Franklin just happened fairly recently, with it 2016, I think was it. So there was a long process between his arrest and the criminal trial. Is that correct?
Yeah, it took 6 years before it went to trial. There was a lot of delays with evidence, or delays with the defense. It was a very frustrating time for the families because during that time, some of the family members, like some of the mothers, passed away, and so they weren't around to see, Lonnie Franklin get convicted. So it was very difficult for the family members, who were going to the trial all the time because, they thought that it was going to be sort of a quick thing, within a year or two, but it took a long time. And a lot of the time, the reason for that is because it was a death penalty case, and so they're very careful, with all the evidence because they don't want it to get reversed on appeal. Right. And that's part of the reason, because I think that a lot of these death penalty cases end up taking like a long time.
And he did get convicted of at least some of the murders and was sent to death row at San Quentin, correct?
Yeah, he was convicted of all the murders and the attempted murder of Anitra Washington. And he was sent to San Quentin death row, where he is to this day. And
he, do you have any speculation or idea why that there's this 12.5-year missing time between some of these murders? Do you have any ideas on that?
Well, the police wondered about that, and there was that was a big question back, when it all happened. They thought that maybe he was in the military, which he actually was. He served in Germany, where he was convicted of gang raping a woman there. But he came back in the 70s and then went on to get married and have children. But during the 90s, at that time, they thought, maybe he was in the military, or maybe he moved out of the country, or maybe he moved to a different state. And that was the reason maybe why, there was that break. But now they don't actually think that, since he was charged, they actually have found other women. They found a total of 15 that they believe he was responsible for, and not all of them have been found. And so that kind of narrows the gap a little. And so, it depends on, who you talk to. Some of the detectives think that he never stopped, and because some of the women were found in garbage dumpsters and probably ended up in landfills. So they think that, there's a larger body count, and that some of the women weren't found in the dumpsters and that they were taken to the landfills and dumped, and we'd never find out who they were.
Right. And as somebody,
and other ones think that he may have stopped for periods of time because he had a series of girlfriends, while he was married. And so they think that, certain times maybe he was happier, he was fine with his girlfriend at the time, for a couple of years, so he didn't kill. And other ones think that also, too, he would have had teenage children at that time. And so they might have been like, why is Dad leaving the house at 2 o'clock in the morning, type thing. So there's a variety of different theories as to what may have happened.
Right. And so we're coming to an end here. Is there anything else that you would like to add, or anything I missed?
No, I think it's I think it's an important story. I think people should know about it, just because I think that a lot of stories get far more attention than this case did. And this guy was, one of the most prolific serial killers in California history. And not a lot of people know about the case. And I think it's important for them to, know about it and to, learn more about the victims, in the case, which, the focus is never usually on. So, well, you
definitely focused on them in the book. So I appreciate that. I think that perspective was very profound, and it just showed that these were people. And it was unfortunate too. It just saw the wreckage of people getting involved in drugs as well, and how they became vulnerable to this predator. So it's.
Well, yeah, I was actually thinking about it the other day. So it's I was wondering. I'm like, would that have ever happened? Would that situation would have happened if the women were, if it was 2019 and not 1985? I mean, there were so many people that got caught up in the drug trade back then, and it was just a horrible time. There was so many overdoses and everything. So would things have been different? Would Lonnie Franklin have been able to be so successful had he been killing women today, as opposed to, back then when, so many women were so vulnerable, they were so, high and, things like that. So they, would get into the car and not know what was going on.
Right.
So if he was doing it today, I mean, I think that he would have gotten stopped a lot quicker.
I agree.
Than it was back then. And also, too, with the story, I find it, a lot of this stuff, a lot of people don't know there was many twists and turns in the story, too, because there was a lot of people arrested along the way. It wasn't like there wasn't any arrests during that time. There were, there was these guys arrested, ended up that they had nothing to do with him. There was one guy, too, who was an LA County sheriff who was wrongly accused, and he was in jail for a number of months, and they believed that he was responsible for the murders. And, he didn't do it, and he ended up, sort of leaving the department in shame, and his reputation was destroyed. I mean, he was smoking crack with a prostitute at the time he was arrested, but, he was charged with, like, murder, murdering, 3 women and all this other stuff. And so, he ended up, sort of, his whole career and everything was, lost, over it. So it's really, and it's also, too, the police investigation, too. They ended up going to Georgia, and there was a chaplain that they, went in. They had to, like, go in there and get his DNA. He was dead, and they ended up having to dig him up, basically, to, check for his DNA because they thought he was he was responsible. So there was a really, it was a very fascinating investigation.
Yeah, it was interesting. I mean, I think you got all those details out very well. I mean, it does show that they were actively, at least looking after, they tied the 2 women together over that span of 15 years, and then that's really when it really picked up. But great book, very interesting read, riveting read, really. Again, the title of the book is The Grim Sleeper, The Lost Women of South Central by Christine Pelisek, Pelisek. Where can people reach you? Are you on social media or any other type of website?
Yeah, I'm at, my Twitter handle is at Chris Pelisek, and I also have a website under my name, and tells more about me and the book and things that I'm doing now.
All right, cool. All right, Christine Pelisek, The Grim Sleeper. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
All right, bye-bye.
Bye.
Okay. Are you still there?